Welcome. We appreciate you joining with us to watch this message. We pray it will bless you, that we'll all learn, grow, and become more like Jesus. Let's join in watching the message at this time.
Hey, we're going to talk about family today. So let's take a look at some pictures here. Do some comparisons. Here is Martin Sheen and his son, Charlie. Name slipped my mind. Both when they were in their 20s. Notice the resemblances. And I think that Charlie looks more like his dad as he gets older. We have Christopher Reeve and his son. Notice those similarities, just, the mouth and everything. And then we have Donald Sutherland and his son Kiefer at the age of 35. And notice the eyes, the smile, the different things that they're just doing in their characteristics to look alike. Let's go to Goldie Hawn and her daughter Kate Hudson, both in their 20s. A lot of resemblance there. And Debbie Reynolds and her daughter Carrie Fisher. Whoops, I skipped one. Meryl Streep and Mamie Gummer in their 30s. A lot of resemblance there. Then we have Debbie Reynolds and her daughter Carrie Fisher. It's just amazing. And this one here I think is really amazing. Jada Pinkett and her daughter Willow Smith in their teens. And just the resemblance, I think, is just fantastic. But it isn't only in looks that we can see similarities from one generation to the next. A lot of times it's in the character of the person. Now, I don't have the education to know whether it is through DNA or things that we pick up from our parents of observation, but at least I can conclude that most of us do similar things as our parents just because we've observed them and learned from them. Some of those are good characteristics. Some are bad. Some are downright terrible. I've seen families that one or two of the parents have got terrific tempers. I don't mean that in a good way. And their kids have as bad or worse tempers yet, where that is carried on. And that's a learned behavior there. Kids pick up profanity and other bad habits from their parents. Say, well, Dad and Mom's doing it, or one or the other, I can do it too. And they want to be like Dad and Mom. And there's other aspects to it also. There can be good characteristics, such as generosity and a loving person and so forth. So good or bad, we often have characteristics that carry from one generation to the next. Other characteristics, such as this past Sunday, a week ago, had a surprise birthday party for one of my 16-year-old granddaughters. And this was on my son-in-law's family side, and they are musicians. They love music. They can play the instruments. They can sing. When they get together as a big family, they sing. So they have great harmony. So when my granddaughter walked into this house, and there were probably 25 to 30 of us in there, and everybody says surprise, and she's shocked because she did not expect this. And then everybody broke out into the happy birthday song. You can only imagine what that song sounded like. Harmony, glorious sound all over the place. They didn't have to work at it. This is just who they are because of their things they developed over the years, started from Mom, and it just kept on going down through the family. It works in other ways. Some of our families are very, very loud. You get a family get together, and I mean it's just noisy, and other families are very, very docile and quiet. There's families that are outdoors kind of people. They just love to hunt or ski or snowmobiles, you name it, ATVs. Then you've got other families that they get their enjoyment just by staying inside, maybe reading books, or maybe there's high educated people. The characteristics often go down from generation to generation. I've seen families that are rotten to the core, and that's just who they are. And then the loving families the other way. The culture of character and mannerism does not always pass from one generation to the next. How many of us have seen bad parents, and there's a great kid comes out of it? Just, opposite, like we'd never figure that would happen. Or we have great parents, and there's a terrible kid that comes out of it. So it doesn't always work that way, but generally, however the parents are, or that culture of the family, then the children pick that up. And it's no different today than what it was thousands of years ago in the Old Testament. Now, when we look at the Old Testament, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that whereas the New Testament teaches, and if somebody does something wrong, we get a corrected teaching, the Old Testament is history. It just lays it out. And sometimes we just shudder over some of the things. You know, we've got David, for example. He sinned with Bathsheba, and God corrected him. That was pointed out. But how many times in the Old Testament do we see sin or bad things that happen and there's no explanation? It's because even though the Old Testament is history, it's poetry, it's prophecy and so forth, it all contains history. And a lot of times the Bible just lays it out. And so it does with Jacob and his family. Jacob is not a godly man in his mannerism, in his thinking and how he treats people. But yet God is going to use, or did use, Jacob. So let's learn from Jacob's mistakes as we look at them. Let's see what he did, and hopefully we won't repeat his bad habits. And eventually he comes around, though. So we continue with our series, Jacob, a work in progress. And that not only describes Jacob, it describes us. I don't care where you are or where I am in our walk with Jesus, we're all a work in progress. Marty kicked off this series a couple of weeks ago with Jacob and Esau. And we saw, he told about how they were born. Esau's once a little bit older than Jacob. And Jacob, though, swindled his older brother out of his birthright. And that's the weakness of Esau, whatever, but at least, Jacob swindled him out of it. Later on, Jacob swindled him out of the blessing. Now, just consider this as though you're in a family and you've got this great inheritance coming when your parents die, and your sibling swindles you out of the inheritance. You can understand the anger that would happen. And when Jacob swindled Esau out of his inheritance, Esau said, I'm going to kill him. And you can understand that. Not that you would want to kill your sibling, but back in that culture. And so Rebekah and Isaac got together and said, okay, we got to get Jacob out of here. So they said they're going to send him to Rebekah's home in Haran, and we'll send him there, get married, and then he can come back someday. But last week what we discovered was that on his way to Haran, Jacob had a God experience where he lay down for the night and he had this dream, and he saw this stairway going up to heaven, and there was angels descending from heaven. There was angels ascending back into heaven. At the top of the stairs was God. And God told Jacob that he was renewing the promise that God had given to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac, and now it's going on to Jacob. I'm going to give you this land. Your descendants are going to be like the dust of the earth. And this really impacted Jacob. When he woke up, he set this stone up as a pillar. He named the place Bethel. And so highly impacted. Although we don't see that too much right away. And as we say that he's a work in progress, many of us sometimes should be more highly impacted than we are when we have a God experience, and it takes us years sometimes to come around. And this very much so describes Jacob. And we're going to see that apples don't fall far from the tree. Now, it's an old saying. Usually it's got to do with a child that acts like the parent, usually not in a good way. A bad characteristic of the parent, the child picks it up, and when the child does that bad characteristic, people say, well, the apple didn't fall far from that tree. So it's not really something that we look at as a compliment, but rather it's an insult, or saying that, well, it's just what it is. It's a learned character trait. So we left Jacob last week at this pillar that he had set up, which was actually the pillow, the stone that he used for his pillow, and he set that up as a memorial to the place that God was in that place, his presence was there. And then Jacob took off for the land of Haran. When he got to Haran, he came upon a well where shepherds would bring their flocks to water their flocks. And evidently there was a stone over the well that would keep the well from getting contaminated, I suppose. And when enough shepherds would get there, they'd take the stone off and they'd water their flocks. So when Jacob is there at the well, this girl comes with her father's flock. It was Rachel. And so Jacob introduces himself to her and discovers it's his first cousin, that her dad, Laban, and Jacob's mother, Rebekah, are brother and sister. Now, let me just pause here to say, sometime sooner or later today, I'm going to get these names all mixed up. So if I say the wrong name and you know the right story, just bear with me, because there's a lot of names that are going to be flying around here after a while. So after he waters Rachel's father's flock, Rachel takes him back to her household, introduces him to his uncle Laban, and Jacob begins working for his uncle Laban. So let's pick up with Genesis chapter 29 with verse 14. After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Let's talk about these 2 daughters here for a little bit. For years, I always understood that Rachel would have been blind as a bat, needed glasses, weak eyes. But in the commentaries that I went through this last week, they said the Hebrew word for the weak eyes did not describe her as having bad eyesight. It described her as having tender eyes. So not an insult or not a description of how bad she was physically, but actually a compliment to her. Tender eyes, loving, caring, compassionate. And you've seen these people. Matter of fact, watch people's eyes. You do, but have you thought about you're watching their eyes? You can tell if a person is lying through their eyes. Watch their eyes and you can see joy, you can see sadness, you can see anger, you can oftentimes see lies in a person's eyes. And when I'm assuming that Jacob is the one telling this story and passed down through the generations, so when he looked at Leah, he saw these tender, loving eyes. But notice what it says about Rachel. But Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Let's go on to verse 18. Jacob was in love with Rachel. Now you understand why he described her as a lovely figure and beautiful. And he's saying this then to his uncle Laban and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." We definitely understand the description. Jacob's in love with Rachel. And so he's naturally going to describe her as very, very beautiful. Now, in the ancient culture, there was a bride price. In other words, a young guy that's going to want to marry this girl, you got to pay a bride price. Usually it's the groom's parents will pay the bride's parents the bride price, and usually the more beautiful and attractive the lady is, the higher the bride price. But it's usually the parents that are going to pay the bride price of the groom to the bride's parents. In this case, Isaac and Rebekah aren't anywhere to be found. I mean, they're back in Canaan, hundreds of miles away. Haran, the scholars think, is someplace up in Turkey. So when you look at Turkey and where Israel is today, you see that's quite a distance, especially if you're walking. So Jacob has to pay this bride price himself. He says, "I'll work for you for 7 years." And Laban, everybody agreed to it. And so for 7 years, Jacob is working so that he can marry Rachel and pay this bride price. So the time comes, the 7 years is done. The Bible says that it passed as it was just a few days. I mean, Jacob was really in love with this gal. So they had the wedding feast, they had the wedding ceremony, and that night Jacob and his new bride go to the bridal suite, to this honeymoon suite, we'll call it. And let's go to chapter 29, verse 25. When morning came, there was Leah. I think we can all imagine that shock. So Jacob said to Laban, who is now his father-in-law, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." Evidently, Jacob never lifted that bridal veil the night of his wedding because he was shocked in the morning. And he complained to Laban. But notice Laban, he had this all figured out. Just go ahead and complete the bridal week as you should. We'll marry off Rachel to you at the end of the bridal. Just talking about his daughters like they're cattle. And I'll marry her off to you. And then you work for me another 7 years. He had that all figured out in his mind. The swindler, the shyster. And so Jacob agreed. The swindler just got out-swindled by his uncle Laban. Now think about this. Now let's pause a little bit. Let's go back in time. We go back to Jacob swindling his older brother Esau out of his birthright. That's the first instance we got. That was Jacob and Esau on their own. But the next instance we have is Jacob's mom, Rebekah, in cohorts saying to her son, "Hey, let's get you the blessing from your dad." That wasn't Jacob's idea. If I read that right, that is Rebekah's idea. Now, what we also have to know is the Bible tells us that Isaac's favorite son was Esau. Rebekah's favorite son was Jacob. Now, that never works out too good when you're playing favorites with your kids, does it? But here we've got the case where Rebekah helped swindle Esau out of his blessings. Do you get the idea? This swindling didn't just come natural for Jacob. Maybe it did a little bit, but his mom was a swindler. And when you go a little bit farther, he got swindled by his mom's brother. You get the family connections here? Somewhere along the line, there's a swindler, there's a grandpa swindler or grandma swindler somewhere along the line that has taught Rebekah and Laban, the brother and sister, how to swindle. And this seems to be a family problem. And so in Jacob's case, when we see that Jacob's a swindler, we can see that the apple didn't fall far from the tree, did it? The bad characteristic was being trained on down through. But let's go a little bit farther. Remember, we've got Jacob's two first cousins involved here, which are now his wives. They also are swindlers, as what we're going to be seeing this week and in the coming weeks also. So it has gone down through the generations, and this is running deep. It's a story worth reading, but we don't have time for it this morning. But Genesis is history laid out for us. So I encourage you to read that story this week. So let's just kind of go on here. We'll tell part of this because it's a long passage to read. Jacob loved Rachel more than he did Leah. The problem of having more than one wife. God saw this. So God opened Leah's womb and she started conceiving and having children. The first one she gave birth to was Reuben. And she had hoped that maybe through this process that Jacob would now love her, or at least find favor with her. She conceived again and had another son by the name of Simeon. Here again, she was still hoping for a little bit of change of heart from Jacob. She conceived again and had Levi. She conceived again and had Judah. Got the first 4 sons. And remember, sons in that culture was the prize. Sorry, ladies, but in that culture, the ladies didn't amount a whole lot. They were loved, but the prize was with the guys, which you can see how Laban treated his 2 daughters. When Rachel saw that her sister was having these babies, she got the idea, well, it's in their culture, said, why don't I give my maidservant Bilhah to Jacob, and he can lay with her, and I'll have children through him. Now, through her, if you remember, Abraham and Sarah did the same thing. Sarah's idea. I'll give Hagar, my maidservant, to Abraham, and we can have children through that method, which messed everything up for centuries. So Rachel gives Bilhah to Jacob, and she bears a son by the name of Dan. She became pregnant again and gave birth to Naphtali. Now, while this is all going on, Leah had stopped having children. Well, she sees what Rachel has done with her maidservant, so she says, I'll give Zilpah, my maidservant, to Jacob so he can have babies. She can have babies there. So Zilpah became pregnant and gave birth to Gad. Leah thought, well, let's do this again. And along came Asher. Now one day, Reuben, which now that would be the youngest son at this time of Leah, he was out in the field, found some mandrakes, and brought them back to his mother. Now, remember, Leah had stopped having children. Mandrakes was thought of as an aphrodisiac, a sexual stimulant, or as a stimulant for fertility. So he brought these back to his mom. Well, Rachel saw this happening, and Rachel said, well, hey, I'll give you Jacob for the night if you just give me your mandrakes. Because she saw this as maybe I can have kids by this method. So Leah agreed, and Jacob slept with Leah, and all came Issachar, I believe, is next. Yep. And then Leah conceived and gave birth again to Zebulun. And then later, Leah gave birth again, this time to Dinah, their daughter. Now, there's a reason we've got Dinah off to the side, but we'll come back to that just real soon. And eventually, God remembered Rachel, and she got pregnant. She gave birth to a son by the name of Joseph. And at this point, Jacob is ready to go back home. Now, one of the commentaries I read said this is a cultural thing also. He said, until Rachel could bear a child, she was still kind of under the oversight of her father. And this bearing a child would have culturally separated that. So, for whatever reason, it does give an explanation as to why Jacob would at this time decide, I'm going to go back home. I'm going to take my family, I'm going to take everything that I've got, and I'm going back home to the land of Canaan. Now, we're going to stop here, but the story is far, far from over, and we'll continue it on next week. And we're going to see the swindling and this chaos of the family is going to continue also. So currently, Jacob has 11 sons and 1 daughter. And if you notice the names of these, they should look familiar to you. That of partial names of the 12 tribes of Israel, which really doesn't have any relevance for over 400 years. But when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, over 400 years from this time, and takes them to Mount Sinai, and God establishes this nation of Israel, then we have the 12 tribes. So this is not the complete list, but you start to recognize the familiarity. And sorry, ladies, but Dinah did not count. It had to be a male figure. But we'll talk about Dinah later on in the coming weeks. So what can we conclude from these strange events that we're seeing of this dysfunctional family that has been carried on through the generations? It does seem to make for a soap opera, like it should be a daytime show. But let's see what we can gain from this. Let's each ask ourselves the question, what cultural characteristics have I grasped from my family or culture? What cultural characteristics have I learned or inherited from my family or culture? And are they good or are they bad? Now, when you think about it yourself, you probably won't recognize them yourself because you grew up that way. And you won't realize if they're good or bad or that you've even got them. You're probably going to have to ask somebody else, a spouse, which may not see them either, your kids, may or may not see them. Your parents probably will not see them. So it might take a friend. And so when you got a church like this, you can generally find somebody that knows you well enough that you could say, well, hey, do I have any bad habits or characteristics that you see that I need to clean up? And if that person is strong enough of a Christian, they will hopefully gently and kindly tell you where you've gone wrong. Let me give you an example. I grew up old school. I've got 3 other brothers, all older than me. And for some reason, it seemed like I'm the guy that latched onto Dad's culture. I enjoyed hearing about Dad's culture. Dad was born in 1916. As a boy, he farmed with workhorses. Puts things in its perspective. He skinny dipped with his brothers in the creeks. That would be back before the creeks were polluted. And the culture at that time was just completely different. My dad lived through the Great Depression and through the World War II era. Farmed all during that time. Had a skimp. Never went to war, but had a skimp. The cutbacks that they had for the war effort especially. Of course, the Depression, they didn't have much. My dad went to a one-room schoolhouse. And they moved around, but the last schoolhouse that he went to was over in the Bluffton, Mount Corey area at the intersection of State Route 235 and State Route 103. And at one time, you could go in that schoolhouse and see what it was like. And as a young guy, I'd gone in that schoolhouse with Dad. And Dad graduated from there from the 8th grade and quit school at that point, because that's what most all the guys did in the rural country, and started farming with their dads. And soon after that, he was on his own and farming on his own that way. My dad had a lot of cultural things, a lot of old sayings and superstitions that he didn't really believe in, but we talked about those quite a bit. And the way of talking and things that he had that didn't make him sound stupid or anything. My dad, for only 8th grade education, you'd never guess it. But he was old school, and I picked up a lot of these things. So I get married, I have kids. So where I stuck with the old school type of things, my kids latched onto the more modern thinking. And when I announced I'm going to go into ministry, ever so often my kids would say, "Dad, you can't say that." Why? Because it's offensive to other cultures, to other peoples, to other nationalities, to other skin colors. I didn't mean anything by them, but it was just how I was brought up. And I really had to suck it up. And it took years to stop saying some of these things. And sometimes I still have to apologize for something that I say. But I was saying things that I didn't understand would be offensive, such as it took me forever to stop talking about cowboys and Indians until my oldest daughter said, "Dad, we have Indians from India living in our neighborhood. They are the Indians." Okay, I get it. But see, it's slow to sink in. And this is the way with many of us. We're raised in a culture with our families, and we pick up these things and we don't recognize them. So this is where we have to become aware. We have to ask other people what it is that we might be saying or doing. But whether it's the cultural characteristics of our family or from the culture, we have to have them pointed out many, many times. So what cultural characteristics do you have? Are they good or are they bad? Now I want to reemphasize a point that Marty started off with 2 weeks ago. And that is that God can always use you. I don't know how many people I've had say, "Well, I couldn't step foot inside that church, the roof would fall in." Well, it's evident they don't know much about the Bible. Because when we look at a lot of these famous Bible characters, they were all flawed. And they all went through a transformation with God. God was working on Jacob. He's a work in progress. Even though Jacob was not a godly man by any things that he's doing right now that we're studying, God was using him, these kids, the family. He's molding him and he's shaping him. Now, even though Jacob is coming along very, very slowly, but God is working with Jacob. He's working with his 2 wives, working with their handmaidens, working with his sons. We're going to see stories about the sons that just make you pull your hair out over some of the things that they did, but they learned it from their dad, who learned it from his mom. And who's to say where she learned it from? See, if God can take a man like Abraham, who at one time worshipped pagan gods, and make him into the leader of going to be the future nation, the father of the nation, if God can take a man like Jacob, who was a swindler, if God can take a stubborn, determined man like Moses, if he can take a prostitute like Rahab and put her in the lineage of David and Jesus, if he can take a foreign Moabite woman and put her in the lineage of David and Jesus, if he can take Peter, who spoke before his mouth engaged, if he can take James and John, the sons of thunder, if he can take Saul, who they cast the clothes of the people stoning Stephen, as they stoned him to death. If God can take these kind of people and turn them into workers for him, Saul became the Apostle Paul, the most prolific writer of the New Testament. If God can do all that with these people, what can he do with you? God can always use you and me. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But unless you and I are willing to ask others and then be willing to change our bad characteristics, and if we're willing to mold and shape ourselves with God's help to become a child of God, then he will definitely use us. Give God the chance that he's giving you to be molded into a child of God, to look like Jesus, because if we don't look like Jesus, we're going to push people away. They won't believe us when we try to tell them about Jesus because we're not acting like Jesus. What character blemish do you have to get rid of? And me. I'm not just pointing at you. If you know of a character flaw that I've got, please tell me. And give others permission to tell you if you've got a flaw, and then work on it. Let's go to God in prayer. Father, we talk about Bible characters that are stubborn and slow to learn, but how many times have we been that person? Most of the time we don't see the flaw. And even many times when we're informed of the flaw, we are stubborn and we don't want to change. Well, that's not hurting anybody. That's my choice. It's just who I am. No, it's not who Jesus is. And if it's not who Jesus is, then it's not who we should be either. I know we've all got our different personalities, and that's fine. That's all within your kingdom. But the things that harms others, the things that harm you, the things that harms Jesus, the things that are destructive to ourselves, Father, open our eyes and make us willing. Make us willing. Help us to surrender. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you for watching the message. If we can help you in any way, we ask that you please contact us. Check us out on our website at roscopchurch.org. You can find the information there, how to contact us. We'd love to hear from you, talk with you, and help you in your walk with Jesus. Thank you once again for joining with us.